We're back. Okay, so this week, HIV/AIDS. One of the topics we're dealing with that is most interesting to me, and that I have more of a sort of a connection to, not because I have HIV or AIDS, but because my early research was on history of STDs, um, specifically history of STDs in East Central Africa. And I was doing research at the same time that AIDS was surging in the area. So, um, it's something that I've been watching from close to the very beginning, and as I said, quite a bit of interest to me. Anyway, so let's go along here and see what we got. Things we want to cover today. Talk about origins of HIV, factors and development of the spread of the virus, the global response to the disease, and was/is AIDS an epidemic. Now, I think, Garrett, well, first off, of course, is too long. He's like 90 pages and so on, and a lot of details she could have been a little more succinct with, right? Um, so I think it's pretty good, although, of course, she ends when she publishes, or just before she publishes, in 94. Not a big deal for her because she's interested in emerging diseases, and of course, it had emerged by then, been emerged for a decade or more. Anyway, but there is kind of like more to the story, as we'll get to here in a bit. Um, so I don't disagree kind of with her approach. Once again, she's dealing with emerging diseases, and especially, although she doesn't use the word too much, but humans and human ecology, right? Our interaction with the environment and how that's leading to certain things. Um, whether it's hantavirus or toxic shock syndrome, or in this case, HIV/AIDS. Which, by the way, interestingly to me, if you go on the CDC website, you look for AIDS, it's not on there. You have to look under HIV or HIV/AIDS. Um, the current approach, kind of intellectually, is to think of this not as a disease AIDS, but as an infection with HIV. So that's where you find most of the info out there. You'll find either HIV or HIV/AIDS. Anyway, so once again, origins of HIV. Garrett stops in 94. Um, there's certain popular perceptions about, I think, HIV origins early on, and I remember this from back in the day. HIV was first reported in 81. That's the year I graduated from high school. And so a lot of this was playing out in the media when I was in college. And anyway, so I'm starting to be kind of more aware about things. I think from fairly early on, people were talking about origins from someplace else, as they usually do, right? In this case, probably right. Even though we noticed the disease in the U.S., seems likely it did not come from here. Diseases typically emerge from somewhere. So, but with better access to healthcare and kind of disease surveillance, it's not surprising we might notice it here before someplace else, right? As you go through Garrett there, I think it's pretty clear, when she's describing the conditions in the clinics in East Central Africa. It's pretty basic stuff, and I've been in some of those clinics, and it's pretty much what she described. I worked in the two major hospitals in Uganda, and yeah, it's kind of like that. Anyway, unfortunately, it became, this finger pointing and issues of blame, so much so that African countries and doctors bristled against being blamed for this, and denied it, buried it in many cases. So much so that Fauci and other people who were involved with this early on then basically took the point of view that, oh, the origin's not important, we just got to deal with it now. And she has a quote from Kenneth Kaunda in here from Zambia, who said the same thing. As a historian, though, I think that's crap. Okay, and I think we missed an excellent opportunity to chart the early part of this disease because we just didn't deal with it, and that's for political reasons. And one of the things you get by looking through this chapter of Garrett is how much she talks about the politics of it. Politics, politics, politics. It's we can't separate it out from the health policy. We really can't. Um, anyway, so we missed that opportunity, and as someone who was doing medical history while this pandemic was emerging, it was extremely frustrating to me. Anyway, so okay, we need to talk about different types of HIV, relationship between HIV and other viruses, and so on. Okay, the two main types of HIV, especially, well, globally, but especially in Africa, are HIV-1 and HIV-2. HIV-2 is largely confined to West Africa, and hopefully, as you know from reading Garrett, is a disease that the progression to AIDS is slower. The transmissibility is less than HIV-1, that means, and generally people are not as sick. Now, unfortunately, HIV-2 seems to be giving way across West Africa today to HIV-1. HIV-1 then is the virus that's responsible for the global pandemic. Emerged probably in West Central Africa, area of Cameroon, developed from monkeys, simian virus that was transferred from monkeys probably to chimpanzees and then to humans. And also probably monkeys to gorillas to humans. And I say and not or because scientists think we have seen this progression multiple independent times. So it wasn't just a one-shot deal and then spread from there. This has probably happened a number of times over the past, year are we 20, 100 to 150 years actually. Is what we think. So HIV-1 then, the major pandemic virus, has groups M, N, O, and P, each caused by an independent cross-species transmission. Okay? Implications of that are, once again, that this has happened a number of times. But also as these groups have developed, the virus then is slightly different. And as a virus, it replicates quickly, but it also mutates quickly. It's actually what's called a retrovirus, uses reverse transcriptase and RNA to replicate, and that process leads to a lot more mutations than a normal virus. Anyway, and then the HIV M is the major type of HIV responsible for the epidemic around East Central Africa. Anyway, groups O and N largely confined to Cameroon, areas around that. Group P found in one individual for Cameroon. I should have shown you a map to show you where Cameroon is, but that's West Central Africa. Okay, right? If you picture West Africa, where it comes around and then it makes the bend and goes south, right there in the corner there, that's Cameroon. Right next to Nigeria. Okay, so we have transmission from simians and apes to humans. Okay, how does that happen? Well, if you want the whole story, although the science is good, the history a little speculative, I do recommend this book by Jacques Pepin, not the famous French chef. Okay, this guy is like a microbiologist. The Origins of AIDS, and this is a 2021 edition, so pretty up to date. And his speculation, and it's a little bit of speculation, the science in this is very good. The history is not as strong, frankly. He relies some on actually the work of a professor I had at undergrad, but he's not a historian. He's a doctor. Anyway, so his assumption and that of most people is transmission must have occurred through cutaneous or mucous membrane exposure in infected ape blood and or body fluids, okay? But as Garrett points out, we're not talking about sex. We're talking about probably monkeys that were hunted by chimpanzees. Chimpanzees then acquired what had initially been a monkey virus, and then humans preyed on those chimpanzees, usually as a food source. Okay? There's what's called the bushmeat phenomenon. Those of you follow the emergence of COVID and this quote unquote wet markets and so on. Well, there's markets across Central and Africa, West Africa, especially in rural areas, where people have a lot of protein malnutrition and get protein wherever they can. Insects, fish, but also wild animals. It's known as bushmeat. The wild areas are known as just as the bush. And these are examples of that are smoked animals or pieces of smoked animals that you can buy in the market. But somebody has to hunt these, is what happens. So the hunters go out, and it's presumed that they're the ones who come in contact then with these wild simian viruses that at some point then mutated, infected humans and then mutated into an HIV from an SIV, from a simian form to a human form. And once again, as animals as a natural reservoir for infectious organisms and contagion, we've seen that before, right? So that's the presumption here, and as I said, the science is pretty well backed up. I mean, we don't have a lot of the history that we could have had, but we do have a lot of genetics, and tracing back the genetic mutations of these types has been a very convincing way, to me anyway, of doing research. Anyway, so when did this happen? So once again, HIV has a rapid replication and rapid genetic change and mutates rapidly. So that actually makes it hard to fight, but it makes it easy to chart the changes in the history. So we have the emergence of HIV-1M between 1910 and 1930 in West Central Africa. All of the known HIV-1M subtypes were identified around Kinshasa, Leopoldville, that's in what is today Democratic Republic of the Congo, or as the cool kids say, the DRC. That's the big country right in the middle of Africa. The earliest strains were discovered there, and based on samples from 59 and 60, HIV-1 had already diversified into different subtypes. What does that mean? It means that it had been spreading for decades, probably. Okay, could be back to the late 19th century. Okay, so the emergence of this is probably having to do with the individuals interacting in the bush, hunting and coming in contact with chimps in their blood. But the historical context is colonial conquest and colonial rule. Okay, and the economic and social cultural changes instituted by colonial rule in the region, especially in the case of Kinshasa and so on. It would be mining and labor migration, and especially the concentration of large numbers of men as miners, which leads to growth of prostitution, which leads to transmission of disease pretty readily. From there, we're looking at a global spread in different ways and types. Once again, M from Central Africa to Eastern Africa, a different subtype from Central Africa to Southern Africa, and from there on to India and other parts of Asia. And then from Central Africa to Haiti in the 1960s, and from there probably on to the US and other Western countries. Okay? That mechanism, not sure if that's Haitian immigrants from Haiti to the US or, Garrett's kind of supposition about gay tourists in Haiti. I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know anything about gay tourism in Haiti in the 1970s. I thought everybody went to the Dominican Republic, but I'm not sure. Anyway, of course, they share an island. So anyway, then we're looking at spread in the U.S. from the late 60s, from the Caribbean to New York City, and then from New York out to New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and the late 70s from New York to San Francisco. And like we see with COVID, once it's here, it's here, right? Okay, you're not going to stop it. It's going to spread. Okay, the only question is how and how quickly. Um, I'll put this link in there. There's a map if you want to take a look at that. Um, Now, fairly quickly, not as quickly as they wanted, but we've had some, medical developments. Maybe I should just show you that map. I think, do I have that? Let me see what I got here. No, that's something else I wanted to show you. That's the UN AIDS. Sorry. We'll get to there. Let me see. There we go. Okay. Now we're cooking with gas, as my grandma would say. There we go. So we see Haiti here, somewhere between 63, 71, so just sort of 69. Transmission up to New York, then of course surrounding areas, and then down to Georgia. And then separately in the late 70s over to San Francisco. And then you can see development and transmission from there. Yeah. Okay, there we go. All right, let's get back to what we're talking about here. Here we go. Just going to move this around a little bit here. There we go. All right. So fairly early on, we're looking at medical developments regarding AIDS. So once again, the first tests were, the first incidents were reported in 1981, and that CDC Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. And then there's the part that Garrett talks about, so I won't discuss much, is the search for a causative organism, which also becomes highly politicized and ends up, in, even more so than she talks about, like you don't need more detail, but, ends up with this agreement between Reagan and Mitterrand that they're going to announce that the U.S. and the French, found it simultaneously. We didn't. It was the French. Okay, the French identified it. And almost everything Gallo did was wrong from that point on anyway. So that they did identify the causative organism as a virus, dubbed first LAV, L-A-V, but then becomes HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. And pretty quickly then develop a test, or actually a number of tests. As you know, once again from Garrett, the initial test had a lot of false positives, and that really led people down the wrong path of how this was going to develop. Finally kind of righted the course. And then by 87, AZT, the first antiretroviral. 94, the first oral HIV test. That's important because otherwise it was a blood draw. And then we have 95, development of antiretroviral therapy that reduces transmission and prolongs life. 2001, generic HIV drugs hit the market. That's very important, especially in developing countries, because you had, first you had AZT and then you had antiretrovirals, but they're really expensive. We're talking about $10,000 to $20,000 a year. Okay, in places in Africa where the per capita spending on health is $3 a year. Obviously, they can't afford that. But once the generics hit the market, and also you start to get global support for the fight against HIV/AIDS, especially, two things. The Carter Center, former President Jimmy Carter's institute in Georgia, and also, though, Bill Gates, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to combat AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. But they support the use of a lot of these antiretrovirals and make them widely available where they wouldn't have been before. We'll look at that number in just a minute. And then finally, 2012, FDA approves PrEP drugs. And these are drugs, for some reason, if you watch daytime TV, especially true crime shows, which my wife loves, you get a lot of pharmaceutical ads, especially ones for PrEP, okay? PrEPFAR, anyway. So these are drugs you can take to prevent becoming infected with HIV. Now, there's no cure for HIV/AIDS now, but there's treatments and there's preventatives. Okay, let me see. Look at the. No, yeah, this is where I wanted to go. Was the UN stats? That was the other one I had up. Here we go. Okay, so hope you can see this. This is, I think this is 2001. Yeah, 2001, global HIV and AIDS statistics. Okay, global HIV stats. In 2001, 38 million people globally living with HIV. 1.5 million people becoming newly infected in 2021. Okay, 650,000 people died from AIDS-related illnesses. Just to reflect on that for just a minute. So we have 1.5 million infections, 650,000 people who die. So the population of people living with HIV is still increasing, right? Okay. Of those 38 million people, 28 million were accessing antiretroviral therapy. That's between 2/3 and 3/4, up to getting close to 3/4. I think that's phenomenal. When you go back to the 90s and so on, when these were first developed, and the numbers were minuscule. So that's a real success story, in my opinion. Since the start of the epidemic, 84 million people have become infected with HIV, and 40 million people have died. Okay, since the start of the epidemic. So let me see here. Breakdown people accessing antiretroviral therapy, new HIV infections. Interestingly, new HIV infections have been reduced by 54% since they peaked in 1996. That's huge to me. Once again. And this is the reason why there's some people, and I think Dan Savage, who's a sex advice columnist, is one of the first people I saw to say this, is that he doesn't consider HIV to be an epidemic anymore. And I think I agree. We've seen the new infections decline. We've seen life expectancies increase. We've seen the development a number of ways to avert transmission, and I think that we're seeing what's becoming an endemic disease now. Okay, I think we are past the epidemic part of it. Not out of the woods, obviously, 1.5 million people, but that's a lot better than what we had seen in the past, and certainly what we had feared. Still problems when we look at the routes of transmission. For example, one of the routes of transmission in developing countries is what's called MTC, mother-to-child transmission. That's what I think they were talking about in Garrett early on. People identified household factors. Well, what does that mean? Well, mostly it's mother to child, which could be in utero, during birth, or after birth through breastfeeding. So that's still a problem. But if pregnant women who are HIV positive are treated with antiretrovirals, it can reduce transmission of the disease. So that's very good. Now you see, the fact is that today, HIV globally is a disease of certain populations. Okay, the risk of acquiring HIV is 35 times higher among people who inject drugs. Okay, we're talking IV drug use. So could be a number of things, but a lot of it's heroin. 30 times higher for female sex workers. Okay, again, not surprising. 28 times higher among gay men and other men who have sex with men. And 14 times higher for transgender women than adult women. We're seeing, as I said, certain populations. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's still young women. Sub-Saharan Africa, 6 in 7 new HIV infections among adolescents aged 15 to 19 are among girls. Okay, and things that are, I think, pretty positive. Okay, 85% of people living with HIV knew their HIV status. That's actually pretty good. Among people who knew their status, 88% were accessing treatment, and among people accessing treatment, 92% were virally suppressed, meaning they unlikely to pass on HIV. So, you know, all these things contributing to what I said. I think what we're seeing largely is a endemic disease now rather than an epidemic disease. Sorry, I got to go back to this. All right. So why so widespread in Africa? Okay. I think there's a number of answers to that. First off, it's the likely point of origin of HIV. Okay? And as such, anytime you have, well, anything emerging, like humans, okay, for example, you have a greater diversity of people near the point of origin, right? Same thing with viruses. So the viruses spread, develop subtypes, and of course develop into some subtypes which are more infectious to humans. And then of course also spread wider before it was recognized. So, those both explain why it would be widespread in Africa, as well as I said, probably more virulent strains like HIV-1M. Another thing, though, is underlying health conditions, and I think this is where early on, as Garrett talks about, in the U.S. they were all like, oh, it's a gay disease, and in Africa they're like, no, it's not. Well, the fact is that those two populations had a lot of commonalities. Okay? As we saw with in Africa, it was sex workers or men who were visiting sex workers, right? So people who are not only having a lot of sexual partners, but their partners are having a lot of partners. Well, that was the same thing among that subset of the gay population in the U.S., right? Okay. Secondly, and obviously dependent on this, a lot of other STDs, okay? Once again, in Africa, where you have this subset of men having sex with commercial sex workers, prostitutes, who then in turn have a lot of partners, of course, you're going to have more regular STDs, right? Chancroid, gonorrhea, syphilis, and so on. Okay, same thing we saw among the gay population, right? As you read in Garrett here, these guys are detailing, the number of times they've had STDs and stuff like that. Okay, well, right there, that makes one more vulnerable both to transmitting and being infected with HIV. A lot of STDs like syphilis and chancroid create sores in the genitals. Well, obviously, if you have a sore, you don't have the skin barrier. Your intact skin is your first line of defense, right? If you have a sore, obviously there's a breach in your line of defense there, right? It's like having a hole in the wall around your castle, and things can pour in. Okay, so someone with an untreated or maybe an unrecognized STD is much more likely both to transmit and be infected with HIV. And once they are, then they're obviously more likely to pass it on as well. Generally, as we see, more young women in Africa, there's two phenomena there. One, it's easier for women if you're talking vaginal intercourse. It's much easier for women to be infected than it is for men. Because women are receptive in that way. But in the same way, especially gay men having anal intercourse are receptive, right? Okay, and the receiver then is more likely to be infected. There's also social factors. As I said, six out of 7 people in Africa in that 15 to 19 range who are getting HIV are girls. Well, why is that? Well, because they're being preyed on by older men. There's this social factors of this sugar daddy phenomenon. Older men trolling around schools and so on, looking for girls, in part because of HIV/AIDS. Okay, they want to avoid, people they think more likely to be infected, so they are preying on younger and younger partners. Of course, oftentimes the men themselves are already infected, although they may not know it, so they pass it on beforehand. Talked about this prostitution and labor migration. There's distrust of condoms in many places. People, especially large, a third or more of Africans are evangelical Christians, and a lot of people there don't like birth control. There's also a lack of male circumcision in large areas. And that's important because the intact foreskin can get more easily damaged. It also traps secretions underneath that can lead to infection. And then once again, there's politics, right? When I was living in Uganda, and the military dictator there, Museveni, I was there in '92, he's still in power 30 years later, okay? Well, that's not part of our story here, but anyway. Well, he was a military dictator, and he was all, anti-AIDS and pro-condoms. He'd talk about it at rallies. You'd see big billboards around town promoting condoms and so on. He'd pass them out at political rallies or whatever. Anyway, which was a responsible thing to do. And they developed what they call the ABC approach to combating HIV/AIDS. A stands for abstinence. Okay? Can't get an STD if you're not having S, right? Okay? Makes sense. So the argument was abstain. But if you can't abstain, be loyal to your partner. That's the B. Be loyal. If you are in a monogamous relationship where you each are loyal and you know you're HIV negative, then you're safe, right? Okay. But if you can't abstain or be loyal, then comes the C, use condoms. Okay? So good advice, solid, easy to understand. And you'd see this on posters and all sorts of things. Okay? Bus stops, wherever. But then what happens? Then what happens is George W. Bush is elected president of the U.S. How does that affect Uganda? Well, it affects Uganda because he is supported by evangelical Christians in the U.S. who also are active in Africa. And they pressure the U.S. government to change the public health message overseas. So they get rid of the ABC approach, and it's just the AB approach because they don't promote condoms anymore. Okay? So it's just abstinence and be faithful to your partner. We're talking humans here, right? How's that going to go? Well, I'll tell you how it went. HIV/AIDS infections, which have been going down, okay, turned around and started going back up again. All right? And since then have started going down, not because of, much intervention, but because that cohort of people who were infected died, and they died quickly. So once again, politics rears its ugly head in a lot of different ways here. All right, that's what I wanted to cover for this week. Thank you very much.